If we all can take our seat, please. So we should start now for the second session, which I will of course invite each discussant to speak about roughly 10 minutes first, each of you, and then we will ask the floor to interact as well before Professor Acharya will be the one who finish the session. And of course we have with me today 5 discussants here. I'm not sure who would like to speak first. Should we organize it according, or anyone would like to volunteer? Okay. So the first person, then I will go according to what is published in our program. The first person will be Dr. M. Rajaratnam, who is of course Executive Director of the ASEAN Dialogue Society, a fellowship dedicated to building a better Asia. He was a special advisor to the ASEAN Secretary General on community building and outreach from 2008 to January 2013. Before this appointment, he was the Director of Chief Executive of the International Center, Goa, India. He started his career as a research fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Singapore in 1971. Dr. Rajaratnam, if possible, I want you to speak very close to the microphone, because right now it's been a live recording and all Chulalongkorn professors and students sitting having lunch or canteen, sitting in canteen somewhere, can listen to us live as well, which is a very good system, and this is the best way that we spread out our knowledge, so somebody is doing something can also receive information and knowledge from the panel here. So please make sure all of us, when we speak directly to the microphone and be very close to the microphone for the sound's reason. Okay, please, I start with you.
Thank you, Dr. Surat, and good morning to all of you. It is a great pleasure for me, of course, to be here with such a distinguished panel of scholars and experts to discuss a very important subject. I also like to take this opportunity of thanking the ASEAN Study Center of Chulalongkorn University, and I was quite impressed. I went around a little bit during the break at how the interest and work on ASEAN has actually transformed. I think here it demonstrates that ASEAN is no longer the tool of the foreign ministers, but an entire society, from sports medicine to faculty of pharmaceutical to the library science, and many, in fact, I think as many faculties as possible are involved in some way or other in this work of ASEAN. It's really very impressive. Having been at the ASEAN Secretariat for the last 5 years, I wonder whether the government or even the Secretariat knows the kind of interest that is generated here on ASEAN. So I'm pleased, to know that the interest continues and deepens as ASEAN moves towards the ASEAN community and the ASEAN economic community. If you are to look at the record of Amitav Archaya's scholarship on ASEAN, you will note that more than any contemporary scholar, he has done much to advance our knowledge of ASEAN and international relations. Amitav is also well known for his love of the idea of ASEAN, and I think from his presentation this morning, you could already see that. And he has often defended the idea of ASEAN rather vigorously, especially when there's a lot of ASEAN bashing at one time. Aside from that, uh, in his book, The Making of Southeast Asia, is actually very compelling reading for those who are interested in ASEAN and Southeast Asia. For those of you who have not yet had a chance to look at the book, I would certainly urge you to do so, because it's one of the few books that try to tie up a lot of things together. In his book, as we have seen, Amitabh has argued that regions are best studied by combining discipline-based and area studies by taking this very regional approach. And to quote him, that our understanding is enhanced. Our purpose is to take the study of Southeast Asia international relations beyond a strict international relations paradigm and demonstrate a relevance to historians, political scientists, and Southeast Asia specialists. In doing so, he has demonstrated that history matters in our understanding of ASEAN and issues of identity, regionalism, as well as the international relations of Southeast Asia. In respecting the past, I think he has talked a little bit about, gone through the whole phase of the pre-colonial and colonial period. And imagining the present and the future, he has made a holistic study of looking at the trees and the jungle as well. The idea of a Southeast Asia did perhaps exist in pre-colonial Southeast Asia in the form of small Southeast Asian kingdoms. Colonialism subsequently divided the region in very profound ways, which affected the issues of space, property, and identity. But colonialism's biggest impact, I think, is in the form of the laws and the political and economic ideas that they brought to the region. And this, in fact, the impact of this has been felt even now and will continue for a long time. Amitav Acharya has also argued Southeast Asia itself is an artificial construct of the colonial powers. In response to the emerging Cold War, at the end of the Second World War, and subsequently and he also mentioned about the fact that the construct has been formed as a result of internal as well as external pressures. But one of the important comments that he makes is that, in his book, is that ASEAN is a very elitist construct as well. I'll come back to that later in my questions. He was also careful to stress the distinction between regional identity as an accomplished fact, which he refers in his book as region in being, to the as a quest, a region in being, and as a region in the making, as well as a quest in the idea of Southeast Asia and Asian regionalism is and continues to be very fragile. Even though peace, stability, and growth have been achieved, ASEAN will continue to be challenged by both internal and external forces. With these very general comments, I like to raise some issues that are relevant to the title of this conference, The Making of Southeast Asia, What Next? I think it was very important for the organizers to ask this question because we have been taking for granted a lot of things about ASEAN. I have about maybe 3 questions, broad questions that I want to ask. One is on regionalism and the whole issue of regional identity. Amitav has argued in his book that the diversity of Southeast Asia is what makes the region distinctive. Due to its complexity, it is also difficult to define this diversity. The central argument of the book is that an evolving sense of regional identity need not be negated by the positions of national identities. You have also made the point that ASEAN is elitist, and many people will agree with you. I agree with you. Civil society is not part of a regular and integral part of the ASEAN process, and engagement continues to be very low. In this context, how do you see, and this is a question directed to Mr. Amitabh, how do you see the further evolution of ASEAN identity and ASEAN regionalism? The second set of questions has to do with the more sub-regional issues. Related to this issue of our diversity is the issue of sub-regionalism in ASEAN. There have been many positive developments in sub-regional cooperation, especially in the economic and social areas. In the past, the unending conflicts in places like the southern Philippines or southern Thailand have been localized. But more tensions have emerged more recently, and ASEAN, in a sense, cannot continue to ignore that. I refer in particular to the whole gamut of issues, which includes the South China Sea as well. But I refer in particular to the emergence of political movements in Myanmar based on religious, ethnic, and linguistic differences. This has been catalyzed by, of course, the recent developments over the Rohingya issue. If left unchecked, this could potentially radicalize the important states of Malacca. I mean, imagine the radicalization of the Somalia states, and I refer to this in the context of what is happening, and as well as divide, maybe even potentially divide mainland and maritime Southeast Asia along such lines. What is the role of ASEAN in containing such an adverse development from happening? I raise this issue also because there are many other issues of credibility that ASEAN itself as an organization faces. And more recently, about 6 months ago, there was the issue of Mr. Sombat Sompon, a Laotian activist who was detained. For over the last 6 months, the ASEAN countries could not move very much to secure some kind of information on his whereabouts. And yesterday I heard some very disturbing news that maybe he's no longer alive. And I think these are the kinds of issues of credibility that will hurt ASEAN much. It's more larger than the issues of human rights that we are very concerned about. In his closing remarks, Amitabh mentioned that there's no Southeast Asia without ASEAN, that the identity was created by ASEAN. Now, what are your own thoughts on institution building in ASEAN? And if we are going to go on to the next level, what next? And in particular, I like to ask the question in particular, what are your thoughts on strengthening the ASEAN Secretariat as a way to move forward for ASEAN in general? So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll just close my remarks.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you have noted the 3 questions. Okay, the next person that I would go to is Professor Muhadi Sugiono, who is currently a senior lecturer at the Department of International Relations and currently the director of Center for Southeast Asian Social Study at Universitas Gadjah Mada. He was former director of the Center for Peace and Security Studies and the head of postgraduate program in international relations from 2007 to 2009 at the same university. He was an Erasmus Mundus visiting scholar at the Network on Humanitarian Action, hosted by the Rijksuniversiteit Groningen in 2008, and a visiting professor at the School of International Politics, Economics and Communication, Oyama Gakuin University, Tokyo in 2011. He also serves as a member of advisory board of the Asia Pacific Center for the Responsibility to Protect, which is R2P, the University of Queensland, Brisbane. He is the author of Gramscian Critiques of Development, and his articles on peace, security, and international relations appear in journals and as book chapters as well. So 10 minutes for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the ASEAN Studies Center for inviting me here. This is a very good opportunity to me to discuss with colleagues here, as well as I'm very pleased to be able to listen to the impressive presentation of by Professor Acharya. I'm always admiring him for his work on Southeast Asia. So I share many ideas that Professor Acharya has expressed. And my understanding of the presentation is that Professor Acharya's
You have to speak very close to the microphone. Is it possible?
Okay. There are 2 points that I can catch from Professor Acharya's presentation. One is that Southeast Asia cannot be taken for granted as an entity, as a region. And secondly, in the process of construction of Southeast Asia, ASEAN plays a very important role. This is something that I share also with the previous speaker about the importance of ASEAN in constructing Southeast Asia. Now, I would like to elaborate further about the importance of 2 aspects that Professor Acharya has mentioned. The first is that in the construction of Southeast Asia, there are 2 dimensions which are very important. That is the internal dimension as well as external dimension in constructing Southeast Asia. And the second one is the past and the present historical dimension in the construction of Southeast Asia. Now, taking into account this external and internal past and present construction of Southeast Asia, if we look at the current development, it is very clear that contemporary development as well as internal development are more important in the constructing of Southeast Asia. And the establishment of ASEAN by initially 5 ASEAN member countries in 1967 has been the very clear manifestation of the importance of the inside development of Southeast Asia, as well as the contemporary development of Southeast Asia in the construction of Southeast Asia as a region. So ASEAN, I agree with Professor Acharya, is one of the most important development in Southeast Asia, which make Southeast Asia more visible to outside world as well as within the region. And looking at the development of ASEAN, basically there are 3 different directions in which Southeast Asia has been constructed through ASEAN. The first direction, what we can call, is the construction of Southeast Asia in terms of strategic and political direction. ASEAN was intended initially simply as a conflict management, as an instrument for the 5 member countries to protect their sovereignty against the intervention both from the neighboring countries as well as from the outside world, from the outside the region, either from China or from other great power. But as we can see, ASEAN was initially established by non-communist governments. And the second direction, which has also taken place in the development of ASEAN, was the direction of the construction of Southeast Asia as an economic entity. During the 1980s to 1990s, it has been overwhelmingly in the Southeast Asia discussed about economic liberalization and free trade and so on and so on. So economic dimension has been very crucial in the second phase of the development ASEAN. It is only in the third phase that identity matters. Identity in the term of Southeast Asia can only be seen as the ASEAN member countries start to talk about ASEAN community. When they think that ASEAN need to go further to develop not only as a political entity, not only as economic entity, but also as a socio-cultural entity. That is reflected in the concept of ASEAN community, which consists of three pillars: security and political community, economic community, as well as the third one, socio and cultural. Now, those three directions has been decided by the ASEAN leaders, that Southeast Asia will be developed into a community based on the three pillars, as I mentioned before. Now, this is the direction of the identity construction in Southeast Asia. What is also interesting is to see the identity construction in terms of actors. If you look at the development of ASEAN, as Professor Acharya mentioned, ASEAN is vital in understanding Southeast Asia, and I do agree with this statement. Even he mentioned that no ASEAN, then no Southeast Asia. That is true. A very intensive interaction among ASEAN leaders has created a sense of communality, a sense of community among themselves. But this sense of community, the sense of communality, can also be seen as a very elitist commonality, a shared perception based on the elite perception of Southeast Asia. So in terms of the actors in the constructing of Southeast Asia, ASEAN is one important actor in constructing Southeast Asia. While it is important, it does not mean that ASEAN is the only actor in the constructing of Southeast Asia. It is very important indeed, but we cannot say that this is the only actor which give the identity to ASEAN. What next? If we look at the development of Southeast Asia, you can also find that business community is playing also important role in the development of ASEAN, in integrating Southeast Asia into single community based on the economic interest. If you look at the development, recent development, the establishment of low-cost airline, AirAsia is quite important development in the Southeast Asia, because you know that while the national flag carrier like Thai Airways, Garuda Indonesia, or Malaysian Airlines fly from capital to capital, AirAsia fly to smaller cities, and it connects people, and it makes people fly as well. So in one of its aircraft, AirAsia has a logo of ASEAN, and also say that this is truly Asian. So this is quite interesting development. So business community need also be taken into account in the development of Southeast Asia. The third actor in the construction of Southeast Asia, Professor Acharya has also mentioned, is the role of civil society organization, as well as the university. The development of ASEAN into more integrated regionalism has also encouraged civil society to increase their network and collaboration within the region. I was also involved in the network of civil society along with the discussion about the draft of ASEAN Charter at the time, and I found that there has been a tendency for civil society to be much closer together along with the closer development within the ASEAN. As ASEAN becoming more and more institutionalized, then the civil society organization is also becoming more and more active in their activities. So we have found that three important actors in the construction of Southeast Asia and give identity of Southeast Asia. And they all based on the understanding of Southeast Asia as an entity, as a region, as a, which cannot be seen simply as a collection of the part, but as a whole, as a community of a region. But there is also one other actor. It is less discussed, but I guess it is not less important than the other three actors. That is the people of Southeast Asia. Its role in the integration tends to be neglected, but it is important to see this is also one important actor in Southeast Asia. We can, or we tend to see that the construction of Southeast Asia tends to go along the same direction. But we can also see that the construction of Southeast Asia can take a very different direction. If we look at, for example, the case of Jama'ah Islamiyah, it can be seen as the other way of constructing Southeast Asia from different perspective and from different directions. So this is something that can be very important and very influential if we look at Southeast Asia in the future. Now, having said that, having mapped out the direction of the construction of Southeast Asia as well as the actors engaged in the construction of Southeast Asia, then two questions remain. The first question is that while the construction of Southeast Asia takes place more and more in the present directions, is it still very questionable whether the historical dimension of Southeast Asia will also influence the construction of Southeast Asian identity? So while ASEAN is the main actor in the construction of Southeast Asia, will the construction of Southeast Asia from ASEAN will be reinforced or will contradict to the process of integration taking place within Southeast Asia in the past? So how will this contemporary development fit to the development of Southeast Asia as discussed by Professor Acharya in historical perspective? Now, with regard to the construction of Southeast Asia by ASEAN itself, it can be seen from the three pillars of ASEAN community that ASEAN has established. How can the three pillars reinforce to each other? How will, for example, the political as well as security community be supported by economic community? And in this case, there seems to be a parallelism, but how will the third pillar of ASEAN community support also the construction of Southeast Asia? I believe that without the involvement of the people, especially in the third pillar, then Southeast Asia will not move forward into the future very smoothly. Thank you very much.
Okay, now we go to Associate Professor Dr. Panithan Wattanayakon from same department, the Department of International Relations, Political Science, Chulalongkorn University. He joined the department in 1993 and has been teaching classes on international relations, international negotiations, research methodology, international relations, security issues in developing countries, and Thai foreign relations. Between January 2009 and August 2011, Dr. Panithan was appointed Deputy Secretary General to the Prime Minister for Political Affairs by the Cabinet, and at the same time served as acting government spokesman. Currently, he serves as a committee member of Chulalongkorn University's Committee on Global and Regional Studies Network and member of the academic committee of the King Prachatipok Institute. Dr. Panithan is also a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum Experts and eminent person. อาจารย์ปณิธานครับ about 10 minutes possible
ขอบคุณครับอาจารย์สุรัตน์ครับ First of all I like to also thank you the organizer to invite me to talk to comment on Professor Amitabh's very interesting book today, especially Jula Global Network, who has been quite active in pushing the interests of ASEAN on campus quite interestingly and successfully. I'm quite very happy to read my good friends' works as always, especially recent writings on ASEAN, of course, as many of the panelists mentioned, the love of ASEAN by Professor Amitabh is very clear. Especially this book, I think I have 3 points to raise for this book. First, about the book itself. I think the book is very, very interesting in 3 senses, especially for the students who seek more understanding about ASEAN. First, I think the approach of Professor Amitabh is quite different on this book. It is a bottom-up approach. He looks at the evolution of the relationships between ASEAN members inside Southeast Asia. And that gives you an inside perspective rather than the outside perspective, especially by Western scholars. And he showed you a lot of activities that forming Southeast Asia and ASEAN by these leaders, by these activities. And that is very unique perspective. That's number 1. Number 2, more interestingly, is also adopted the interdisciplinary approach. And this is very, very, to me, very a powerful approach in looking at Southeast Asia and ASEAN. Not one approach, not economic, not politics, not international relations, not history. Usually we approach, we take classes on Southeast Asia, we often immerse ourselves in historian perspective. But this book is interdisciplinary. It gives you a much more deeper and richer ways to analyze the situation. That's a second very, very, I think, positive or advantage of this book. And third, in particular, for the students of IRs, you should be very, very pleased or very, very impressed, because it also takes the IR, international relations, perspective, in particular, in terms of the outcome. In other words, the products of intra-ASEAN activities, interdisciplinary approaches. Professor Amitabh also tried to predict the international relations between these countries among themselves and with external powers. And this is very unique for the IR students to look at the ASEAN this way, to predict what ASEAN will behave based on these approaches to the US, to China, to India. I think at the end of the conclusions, I think he gave a very interesting predictions on the US pivot policy, the rebalancing and returning of China to the region, the returning of the India to the region. That's very unique also for the book. So this is the strength of the book. That's my first point. My second point is, of course, although I like the book very much, and I'm also very much impressed with Professor Amitabh's writing on ASEAN, but I'm still very puzzled between the 2 main ideas. I think we understand about Southeast Asia very well based on the historical perspective. We understand the coming of ASEAN very well. But to me, at least, I'm not so certain or so clear about the relationship between Southeast Asia and ASEAN. What is the relationship between the 2 identities? To me, I think chapter 5 in this book provided some clue, but still, to the lack of my satisfaction, I'm not so certain what are the real relationship. It seems to me that Southeast Asia is more based on the socio-geographical perspective. ASEAN is based on more politics, more governmental perspective. But how are the two evolve together? We seem to use Southeast Asia and ASEAN interchangeably, but I don't think the two are the same. I think this is less clear to me, and maybe Professor Amitabh can enlighten us more on this issue. That's my second point. My third point is about challenges to ASEAN in particular. I think the book mentioned some of these in the latest chapters, but to me, there's still a lot of questions remain. For example, number one, on one hand, we know that Southeast Asia is an emerging community, but on the other hand, it's becoming more and more real. You look at ASEAN way, you look at ASEAN centrality, you're looking at a very interesting ASEAN Charter. These are the real institutionalization. My question is, how can you institutionalize imagination? I think this is very problematic for me. If you argue for one hand, it's an emerging community. How can you institutionalize it? In fact, we are institutionalizing these things. That's number one. Also, second point on this issue, I don't have any problem with economic integration in ASEAN. I think the market mechanism will lead the way. I don't think we can force the market mechanism too much. The Thai government recently learned very, very hard lesson. They try to force the rice market. They cannot go against the rice market mechanism internationally. That's not possible. So I don't think ASEAN has any problem in going with the flow. I don't think integration in economic sense is going to go quite well if you go with the market mechanism. But I have a problem with the ultimate goal of ASEAN, like the EU. It needs a political commitment. Can you force the political commitment in the globalization? Can you force more political commitment in a very active environment when China is trying to take some ASEANs one way on the South China Sea, when United States and others are trying to take ASEAN the other way? The commitment of the political leaders are very critical. I remember when Prime Minister Chuan Lik Pai, I was working for him at that time when he was a defense minister, wanting to send the troops to keep peace in East Timor. He has to dispatch Dr. Surin Pitsuwan to consult with Indonesia president first to see if our ASEAN friends would like us to be more active under the name of the United Nations. I think that commitment is very clear. This community is depending on the high level of commitment to hold on to that identity, and that's very clear. Once we are clear by Indonesia, by Malaysia, then we say yes to the United Nations, to Australia, and to the United States to send our Thai peacekeeping troops to Timor. I think that's one incident. The second incident I remember very well that in the cabinet meeting in April 2009, there were the discussions of whether or not we should hold the summit, the 14th summit in Pattaya. We know that the red shirts are protesting, and there will be very complicated summit meeting. But in the end, the cabinet decided that the ASEAN summit is very important for ASEAN, despite some of the threats posed in the summit. And in the end, of course, we had to cancel the summit. But I think the cabinet went ahead anyway to commit to ASEAN, because this is very important. This is the first time that the ASEAN will be discussing about financial crisis. They will be discussing about ASEAN Charter. They will be discussing about North Korean rocket missiles at that time testing. So again, you see the high level of political commitment. The problem is how long they can keep this permanent. Is it permanent or not? To me, it depends on the commitment at a higher level. But then again, if you look around, like my friend Rajaratnam is pointing out, I think the new permanent ASEAN identity will be based not on political leaders alone in the future. I think it will depend on new generations of people, younger generation. We were born with no ASEAN identity, but now new generation, they were born with ASEAN identity. High schools are now teaching ASEAN at a lower level. They were born with it. I think after 90s, I think the situation is now changing. Permanent, yes. I think in the mind of the younger generations, as surveyed already by many organizations. I think in the book also mentioned in the